Hi. Everyone, we're just getting started. We have a bunch of people signed up, over 50 people registered, which is awesome. I was not expecting that for this kind of topic, but it's one of the topics that I'm most passionate about. So I'm gonna wait a little bit longer to let some more people join since it's just 12:30 now. Hello. Hi, how are you, Simone? Hi. Hi, Nika. Hi, Jason. Hi, John. Welcome. So my internet has been very spotty, sadly, for the past couple of days. So if for whatever reason it's not working and you can't hear me or something pauses, if you guys could just give me a little ping in the chat, that would be great. But it kind of keeps looking like it's searching, but so far so good today. But just keep me posted if anything kind of goes wacky during the chat. I'll probably just give things a couple more minutes just because there's a lot to cover and I do want to be mindful of everybody's time. All right, so just one more minute. We'll give them 3 minutes and then we'll kick things off. Okay, hi Courtney. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. We are waiting one more minute and then we're gonna get things kicked off. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen and get everybody started. So hold on one second. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? All right, hopefully you guys can see the screen. If you could just kind of ping me and let me know if you can see it, that would be awesome. Okay, thanks, Nika, perfect. So yeah, all right, so we're gonna get things started. So I think some of you guys joined me last week for last week's Lunch and Learn on effectively talking to your team. For those of you who are just joining today for the first time, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction into who I am and why you should be listening to me about zero-based budgeting. So my name is Jess, and I founded Sprezatura as a modern day management consulting firm. Before starting Sprezatura, I founded 3 companies and sold them. The last company was acquired in 2017. And I worked at the companies that bought the different companies that I founded for a little bit. But one of the things that I had always come back to running my startups and small businesses was that there was never any consulting firm out there for when there were problems. So thinking, pricing strategy, discounting, do I cut, this entire component of our app? There were very specific agencies like growth agencies and design agencies, but there was nothing like a McKinsey for small businesses. So that was really the impetus for starting Sprezatura, and we offer 3 main types of services. So the first type is very traditional consulting work. Right now, the bulk of that is falling into crisis road mapping and recovery, because most companies right now are unfortunately going through an unimaginable crisis. So we kind of do a huge deep dive audit into everything that's going on at your company, plan launches, your org structure, and all of the different components to create either a 1, 3, 6, or 9-month roadmap for you. And then we meet on a weekly basis, because things are changing so rapidly right now, to make sure you're staying within the guardrails and can talk through any of the actuals and adjust the forward-looking plans accordingly. So that's our crisis road mapping. Another service that we offer is called Business in a Box, and that's where we work with founders and take them from idea to launch. And we have a 5-phase program that we've used successfully for several different types of brands, and it's one of the favorite types of services that we offer. And then the last type of service that we offer is called operational finance. And so really operational finance is what an outsourced CFO should be doing, but unfortunately most outsourced CFOs are glorified accountants, and all they're doing is reconciling your books and giving you monthly reports. But what a true CFO does is they give you operational recommendations from the insights that they have in your financials. And so that's really a service that we offer that actually helps you avoid crises, because we kind of have our eye on the ball with you the entire time. So those are the services that we offer, and today's topic is about zero-based budgeting. So many of the companies that we are working with and that are also just kind of reaching out for consultations are clearly focusing on cost cutting right now. And unfortunately, a lot of companies, when they start thinking about cost cutting, they jump right to their expenses without doing what is called a contribution analysis. And by doing that, you're kind of missing the forest from the trees a little bit. So I want to walk you through the process that I use with companies, especially now, who are looking to cut costs, to create a roadmap towards profitability and to really understand their expenses. So the first thing I want to focus on is that your company, if you have an outsourced CFO, or if you have an internal CFO or accountant, most likely they're providing you with a traditional P&L. If you have QuickBooks or you're using SAP or any of the other accounting software, you can easily export this from there. So I've exported a portion of a P&L of one of our clients. Obviously took names off, so nobody knows what it is. And so what I did, I took a P&L that looks on an annual basis, and please let me know, I know the numbers are small, it's not about the numbers here, it's just more about formatting. So don't worry if you can't read exact numbers, it's not necessary. So when you have a P&L, the problem with doing any sort of cost-cutting exercises while only looking at a traditional P&L is that your P&L is only going to show you your gross profit. It's not going to show you contribution profit. And I'll get into what contribution profit is in a second. But first, let's talk about gross profit. So gross profit is where you take your gross revenue and you subtract out your discounts and markdowns, any returns, and the cost of goods sold. And also, by the way, because this is a lunch and learn and not like a customized deep dive, This is tailored towards physical goods companies. I can kind of, if you have questions specifically about a services business or a content business, you know, you can ping me after. My email is on the last slide, but it's just jess@spreadswithher.inc.com, and we can just talk through what a contribution margin looks like for that type of the company. But this is just so you know, this is a physical goods company. And so that gives you your gross profit. So you're taking out the discounts, you're taking out returns, and you're taking out COGS. So then you're looking at your gross profit and you're like, wow, this is awesome. You know, like the amount of revenue I'm bringing in minus all of those three things equals a positive number. So this is great. And now let's get to cost cutting. The problem with that is that it doesn't give you a true picture of your business. Number one. Number two, it is combining all your sales channels into one gross profit. So if you look at the bottom row of this slide, it gives you your gross profit. And for this business, they sell direct to consumer on their e-commerce site, and they also have wholesale accounts. You might also have a retail channel where you have your own physical store. That would be another channel. If you do, all of those channels are going to be in the gross profit combined. So that is another huge issue with building out any sort of cost cutting or budgeting from a traditional P&L, because you don't have a window into how each channel is contributing to your business. So that brings us to why contribution profit and contribution margin is so imperative as your first step before you start cutting expenses. And when you do start cutting expenses, I do advocate for and recommend zero-based budgeting, which we'll get into in a little bit. So contribution margin. So what we do when we are working with a company that's in crisis mode, that, you know, some of our clients' revenues drop 90%. And clearly, if you don't have deep reserves in your savings account to weather that kind of storm, you need to start cutting expenses immediately in order to stay afloat. So the first thing that we do is we export the P&L into Excel, and we create our own model that breaks down all of your expenses into contribution expenses and operating expenses. And we do that, but for each sales channel. So I'm just giving you this as an example to see. The numbers, again, don't matter. So for this company, as I said before, in the traditional P&L, how it combined e-commerce and wholesale, what we did here is we broke out e-commerce and wholesale into two separate channels, and we did contribution margins for each as the first step before starting to even think about expenses. So if you look here at the circled area, the first thing we have is your traditional gross profit. That's exactly what you have in your traditional P&L. And then the next thing that you want to add in is you want to add in any of your direct marketing expenses. So I'm not talking about PR or event marketing. I'm talking like performance marketing, where you can attribute a very specific return on your ad spend. So think Facebook ads, Instagram ads, Google, where it's, you know, a direct attribution. When I take that, I look, you know, as I'm analyzing that, I usually use a 28-day attribution window for that, but, you know, that we can have a whole other call about performance marketing analysis with a financial lens. But so that's the next thing you're going to add in here. And so as you can see here, this company increased their spend by a lot. So the total performance marketing spend going year over year went from 381 to 384 to 514. But as you can see, the contribution, sorry, that went behind. The contribution percentage of revenue dropped. So that's always a really good sign. That means that this company's ads in particular are performing better year on year as their spend goes up, which is always what you want. But if you look at the percentages, 29% of your revenue is a really big portion of performance marketing if you're in a situation where nobody's spending money. So that is an area where you want to think about reducing expenses to get that percent of revenue down. And by the way, I know you guys can't talk, but there is the Q&A feature on the bottom. So you can either, if you have any questions, like feel free to like dive in with questions now, or you can wait till the end when I have a little Q&A time. If you have a private question, you can do it in the chat. If you want everybody else to see it, you can put it in the Q&A. And again, like I'm more than happy to talk specifics offline after the lunch and learn. Okay, so that's where, so in addition to your gross profit, which is COGS, discounts, markdowns, and returns, the next thing you add is your performance marketing expenses. Then you're going to want to add in all of your storage and fulfillment expenses. And the next thing you're going to want to add in is all of your direct merchant fees. So when you think about your contribution, this is really like a variable number. So if you cut a sale, then you're not going to have to pay your credit card processing fee. You're not going to have to pay your warehouse to do the pick and pack. You're not going to have to pay FedEx to ship that package. Clearly, the cost of that good is not factored in. So when you get to your contribution margin, it's going to take, you're going to take all of the expenses that are truly variable costs. And that's when you're going to arrive at your company's true contribution profit and margin. So for this company, as you can see, this is kind of a spanning several years. So in 2017, when we started working with them, the contribution margin of their e-commerce business was negative 35%. So that means for every dollar somebody was spending, they were losing 35 cents, which is crazy because that negative 35 cents is eating into nothing, because this is where you're supposed to be adding to cover operating expenses. So over the years, we got them into the black, but having a 3.6% contribution margin is not great. You really would want to target a 25% contribution margin. And again, these are very general recommendations, you know, but that across the board is what I would recommend people aiming for right now. Because once you determine that this particular channel is only contributing $75,000, or roughly 3% of the total revenue, that's going to be very eye-opening for you as you start to think about your operating expenses. So now your operating expenses are your fixed expenses, like salaries, rent, utilities, kind of everything that doesn't vary based on each individual sale. And just a note, that was an exercise, this contribution profit and contribution margin exercise, that's an exercise that we did for e-commerce, and then you replicate it for wholesale. And then what we do is we take each channel and we combine them all to give you your combined contribution, margin, and profit. And that gives you an idea of how much money you have to play with to cover your operating expenses. So let's just pretend for a moment that this company didn't have wholesale, and all they were generating was sales on e-commerce. What that means is, so we're gonna just do some like basic percentage here, and I broke this down, and obviously like if there are math wizards here, this is gonna seem very dumbed down, but I wanted to make it friendly for everybody, depending upon how long ago it was that you were doing percentages. So to determine the delta between what you are contributing and what you have to cover in your operating expenses, let's just think about this. So for this particular company, their operating expenses, think salaries, rent, all of those fixed costs, were $2 million. So if their contribution margin from their e-commerce sales was 5%, And that's generous because it was 3.6. The question that they need to ask themselves is 5% of what number, what revenue is going to equal 2 million? So they would have, if they didn't have wholesale, they would have to generate $40 million of revenue just to cover $2 million of operating expenses. So that's just to break even. That's not having any profit whatsoever. So this is why I always advocate to companies to do a contribution margin and a contribution profit breakdown before just diving in and saying like, oh, we got to cut PR, and oh, we're going to cut this person, and we're going to cut this entire team. Because if you don't look at your contribution margin first, you're going to be focusing on operating expenses, but what you really need to be doing is making your contribution margin better. And that's where we're going to get into kind of talking about zero-based budgeting. So there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done before you can just like start cutting expenses across the board, because if your contribution margin is not good, like 5% is not good, then it doesn't matter how many expenses they cut. You know, for them, you know, that company would never hit 40 million in revenue. So it doesn't matter what their expenses were. You know, even if they cut their operating expenses in half to 1 million, that would still mean that they would need to generate $20 million in gross revenue, which they're not doing, to cover those expenses. So you want to understand first what that overarching number is that you need to hit before you start just looking at your operating expenses. So zero-based budgeting, for those who haven't done it or haven't heard about it, zero-based budgeting is really common in turnarounds. So part of the work that I've done in Spreadsatara is I've taken over two of my clients as CEO to do turnarounds. And I hate the word turnaround because it implies that the company is not going in the right direction and we have to go backwards. That is not the case. So I really hate the word, even though it's become very commonplace. It's really about, let's kind of figure out what destination we want to go to. Like, let's say we were sailing, you know, to a certain island, but then we realized like, oh, there's a hurricane there. Maybe we don't want to go to that island, but there's an island, you know, that's not so far away that has incredible weather and no hurricane. So maybe let's like change course and also figure out how we can make our ship a little bit more efficient so we can get there faster. But like, I'm never turning ships around and going backwards. So I do hate that terminology. But one of the things I always do is zero-based budgeting when I go in. So what that means is the bulk of companies do lazy budgeting, which means like, let's look at what we spent last year, or let's look at what we spent, you know, in Q1 of last year, and use that as our base and see, do we need to increase it? And then what's really lazy is just like increasing everything by a percentage across the board. And if that's what you're doing, like, don't worry, the majority of companies do this because nobody likes budgeting. So this is not to say like what you're doing is bad or to make you guys feel bad about how you're focusing on your budgets. But what you really should be doing is starting every year with a zero base. And every single expense should be justified for the forward-looking year, based on what you want to do as a company and what everybody at the company has sort of bought in as the ultimate goal. So you can use obviously last year's expenses as a guidepost, but just because you spent, you know, $10,000 on a research and development trip to Greece like last year to get inspiration with fabrics, like, doesn't mean that you need to do another R&D trip. Like, you might be able to get R&D super cheap going to a you know, a secondhand store. So yeah, so that's the kind of just what zero-based budgeting means. It means we're starting at zero for all of our expenses. The next thing that I always do and that I recommend is focusing on increasing your contribution margin and your contribution profit first. Because like with the company that I was showing you before in that example, if that contribution margin was 25% instead of 5%, now instead of having $75,000 to play with, I have $225,000 to play with. Now, yes, that doesn't come close to covering the $2 million in expenses, but it gives me a lot more to play with than if I only had 75,000 or a 5% contribution margin. So how can you focus on increasing your contribution margin? This is where you want to start focusing on renegotiating contracts, because right now, like, it doesn't matter what your business is, aside from grocery, but even some grocery stores are, you know, struggling with the supply chain. You can negotiate your contracts. So contribution types of negotiations. Contact your warehouse and see if they can give you better pricing on pick pack. Because you might have more things being stored for a longer period of time, because you don't have a lot of sales coming in, your storage fees are flat. That's an operating expense, but your pick pack, like the amount you pay for someone to go pick it out of the box, put it into your shipping box, put the label on, and send it out, that is a variable cost. So that's something that you could negotiate, because that'll drive down that expense. Contact your shipping, your shipper, so FedEx, DHL, USPS, etc. And I would actually recommend at this point, if you are a physical goods company, to just go out and get bids from all of them and renegotiate based on a competitive price. It's something where you don't just you want to make sure that you do an analysis. So like anytime we do renegotiation for someone regarding shipping, it's very specific the way that shippers bill. So they might have this kind of thing that they sneak in there called a residential upcharge. And if you are a direct-to-consumer company, the bulk of your shipments are going to residential addresses. So they kind of slip that in and don't put that into the overall specifics. So there are very like detailed tips on how to get the best rates for your business. But in general, that's an area where if you can get that expense down, and we were able to cut that expense by 50%, just so you have like a benchmark, which is insane. And we didn't switch providers. We just went out to the market, got a competitive bid, went to them and said, do you want to lose us or do you want to keep us? And they wanted to keep us. And so, so they reduced the fee by 50%, which is incredible for adding to your contribution margin. Merchant fees. So this is a time where you can also do the same thing with that. Like if you're using Stripe or Authorize.net, get competitive bids and use one to play off the other. But all of those things are your contribution margin. Most likely you've already bought your inventory. So there's not much you can do on COGS, on cost of goods sold, for what you have in stock already, because you've already paid for it. But, you know, if you want to, now is also a great time to think about negotiating with your factory. So all of those are your components. And then performance marketing. So performance marketing obviously is not something you can negotiate on. This is something where if your ads are performing, then they will be a lower percentage of your revenue. So if your return on your ad spend is 8x versus 3x, obviously that is going to be a really good thing, but it's not something that you can negotiate. You can do better testing with your ads. You can lower your spend right now, just knowing that a lot of people are probably not shopping. And you can just focus on like really, really high performing ads, like a DPA pixel ad or like retargeting, things like that, where people have already expressed interest, but prospecting, you know, might not be the best. We do have a lot of other webinars coming up with really awesome content regarding marketing. But now is not the time to cut your entire marketing budget. It's just to be smart on your performance marketing, because if you start to see your ROAS drop below 3, that's where you get into territory where it's going to be really bad for your contribution. So that's kind of the first thing. And then, the second thing. So then the third thing. So once you actually feel really good about maximizing your contribution profit and margin for each channel, then you can determine whether any channel needs to be cut. So as I was showing you earlier, when we did that whole channel analysis, and the e-commerce channel for that company was was at a negative 35% contribution in 2017. If I came into a company now and was doing crisis management and crisis road mapping, and I saw one of their channels was at a negative 35% contribution, now is not the time to try to like improve that. And as you saw, that took 3 years to just get it to a positive contribution. So if you have a channel that is at a negative contribution, that's where you need to think about cutting the channel, like just shutting it off. And I know that that sounds insane, that you would just shut off a channel or like shut down a retail store, but that's the kind of stuff that you need to be doing during a crisis. Because if you have any channels that are losing money for you at the contribution level, like that's not something you can support right now unless you've just raised money and have a boatload of cash in the bank and you're fine weathering the storm. But if you're trying to really cut expenses and manage here, like this is where you start cutting channels. So, you know, we've cut pop-ups, we've cut retail, we've cut wholesale partnerships, you know, because if they're losing you money, like at the wholesale level, if you think about what's at the contribution, you know, anyone on here who hasn't worked with wholesale, these terms might seem foreign, but co-op marketing, where you pay to be in Bloomingdale's catalog, like they're not just like putting things that they like, you pay for those placements. You know, if you take in all of their software compliance for any of the major department stores and the co-op marketing expenses and the chargebacks that they do and, you know, any sort of returns that they're doing, like if you're realizing that your wholesale channel is at a negative contribution, just like contact Macy's, contact Zappos and say like, I either need better terms or like, I'm not going to be working with you in the future. And that's, you know, a reality. So that's, you know, number 3. Number 4 is at that point, only after you've done the exhaustive work of really looking into your contribution channels, that's when you get to start looking at your operating expenses and where you want to get them down to your bare minimum so that you can cover all or the majority of your operating expense with each one of your channels' contributions. So when you're looking at operating expenses, and I know it's already 1, and I said that I was going to try to keep these to 30 minutes, but we're going a little bit over. So if you do have to jump, like, no worries, I'm recording this, I can send it out to you. But that's when you want to look at your operating expenses. So the first thing I always look at is vendors. So vendors and contractors are much easier. Like the last thing I'm looking at is cutting team members, because when things pick back up, it's really a huge opportunity cost to have to rehire someone, because that person might not be waiting in the wings to be rehired and to train them and get them up to speed. So that's a really big opportunity cost to let someone go who is a really good performer just because you can't afford them. So I try to do team cutting last, but the first thing you're going to want to focus on are your vendors and independent contractors, and really looking at what they are contributing to you right now. So PR, unless you're doing something that is really spot on and is kind of out of the box thinking during this crisis, not many people just want to like write about your brand's products. They want to write about, because that's going to feel really tone deaf for the publication or for the news outlet. And so unless you have a really good angle in terms of what you're doing, so think, Barry's boot camp was on Good Morning America because they're offering tons of free at-home workouts on Instagram Live. Levi's 501, they're doing a concert series every day at 501 for free on Instagram, because even though Levi's has nothing to do with music, they understand really fundamentally what their customer persona is, and they know that they would probably really like a concert at 5. And so if you're doing things like that, by all means, like PR is important because you want to get press for the good work that you're doing during this crisis. But if you're not, then that's an area where you might want to say, can we put this on pause and we'll extend our contract for X number of months. So if you have 8 more months in your contract, maybe pause it for 2, and then it'll extend out for 10 months, but you'll have 2 months where you won't pay. They might say like, no, we can't afford to not have 2 months of revenue, then say like, maybe we'll still extend it, and we'll pay, a little bit now just to keep your lights on, but we don't need you to do any work. But this is where you really have the opportunity to negotiate contracts. As you're looking at your vendors, you want to really, really understand what their contract is. Because we had someone, before we started working with them, go to a warehouse and say, oh, we're going to terminate this part of our contract. And they were like, okay, great, but like, you have 9 months of left on your termination clause. And they didn't realize that. So before you start terminating anything, make sure you read your contract, because different vendors have different termination clauses. So even if you say, I'm terminating you now, they still might have 30, 60, 90 days, or at worst, like 9 months in terms of a notification period. So that's kind of with vendors. The next thing is your rent. So a lot of landlords are being really generous. I know WeWork is not, but they also have a very small termination window, so you could just give your 30 days notice. But obviously a lot of you guys are working from home, so if you're not using your office, now is a really good time to negotiate on rent deferment. So whether that is the same type of thing as your vendor saying, we're really sorry, but we're not using our office, can you extend our lease for X number of months, and we won't pay you for these couple of months. But some landlords are being really understanding, others aren't. You just want to always reach out. And one thing that I will say though is, if you do have interest-bearing loans, like those are things that you don't want to not pay, in terms of when you're just looking at bills to kind of put off, like your credit card, any sort of inventory financing, like don't let those lapse, because those could be really detrimental to your business's credit going forward. And then the last thing that you're going to want to focus on is your team. And what I like to do before just like cutting team members is really focusing on, what does my company need from a roles and responsibilities perspective right now, and what does each person on my team currently contribute, and who on the team has really stepped it up or could step it up to take on other responsibilities, and who can't. Also, if you have a brand that's selling to wholesale and your wholesalers are like, we're putting a freeze, like that might be someone that might not be necessary, but they might also be able to jump into something else. So you really want to understand your team and do like a full picture, org chart, understanding what people's current responsibilities are, what their total capabilities are, and where you can kind of rejigger things in there. But like what we talked about on the last lunch and learn, you definitely don't want to be, insensitive during this time. Like if you do have to terminate people, please call them, have a video chat at best. Don't send emails firing people. Give as much severance as you possibly can, because these are the people who've really sacrificed for you, and they are probably going to have a very hard time finding jobs. And then the last thing I will point out with zero-based budgeting, because you can take it a little bit too far, is sometimes you just start cutting expenses. You're like, oh, we don't need that, or oh, this is unnecessary and this is unnecessary, and you've gotten it so lean and it's great, but then you in the long picture, a la what Kraft Heinz did, you could read the case study about the zero-based budgeting exercise that they did, which didn't go as well. They sacrificed so much of their brand identity and brand marketing and their future rollout plans just to operate in the leanest way possible. So as you're doing zero-based budgeting, you do want to think about, do I need this? Like, is this absolutely necessary? Number one, but is it something where if I cut it now, am I going to put us at risk in the future? So another company that we were working with cut their entire email marketing team and said, the founder said, like, I'm just going to do it myself. When I came in and I looked at what their email channel was contributing, and that's another thing, like for clients, will sometimes break each one of those channels, like break e-commerce down into email, direct sales, repeat, etc. Like you can get super detailed on it if you really need to get insights. So when they did that, I just kind of did like a little gut check analysis to see was that a good decision? And unfortunately it wasn't, because email was generating a very high proportion of their e-commerce revenue, because their emails were amazing. And by cutting the team and kind of just like having the emails fall off, they were sending them maybe like twice a month versus 3 times a week into segments of the list, and everything was very personalized. That was a huge hit to them from a revenue perspective that they weren't preparing for. So as you do make decisions thinking like, well, we don't need all of these team members, you really want to be very specific and wise in terms of what those team members are contributing to the bottom line, which is why it goes back to the beginning of contribution expenses. So I know this was a lot, and I know we went a little bit over in terms of time, but does anyone have any questions about anything that we went over today? My email is down here on the bottom, jess@sprezzatura.inc.com. If you guys have questions that you don't feel comfortable asking, you know, in a bigger forum, and you have specific, I'm more than happy to jump on the phone with any of you. But yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing, and yeah, so if nobody has any questions, I'll wait like a second just in case you're typing something longer. But oh, thanks, Jason. Thanks. I'm glad it was helpful. And just to announce, so we are going to, we were doing these weekly, now we're doing them twice a week. So we have another one on Thursday, which is an amazing topic. I'm actually really excited about it. Court Williams, who actually runs Instagram's creative shop for luxury brands, he's going to be leading it and talking about how to create incredible content from home when you have extremely limited resources, aka your iPhone. And yeah, he has incredible tips. I've already seen some of the things that he's recommending, and I'm using them, and they're awesome. And so he's incredible. And then next week we have that's kind of a 2-part series with Court again, and Anna Angelic, who is a Sprezzatura team member. She is an incredible brand and marketing strategist and has had her hand in dozens of brands in terms of their strategy. But as I was saying with the zero-based budgeting, when we go into brands and do crisis management, we do it from a very holistic perspective. So we're not coming in and just looking at the financials and saying, cut this, cut this, cut this. We also understand fundamentally how important brand and how important marketing is for when this kind of storm blows over. So we always incorporate both. And one of the services that we do offer with crisis road mapping is your brand strategy. So the 2 things that we're covering, and these are 2 things that we offer as a service, are revamping your brand's visual language during a crisis. And then part 2, which is next Thursday, is changing your tone of voice during a crisis. So instead of using, the same ads that you were planning on using to launch a product, maybe, being mindful of where people are, aka sequestered at home, and highlighting what everybody's going through. So you seem empathetic, and you seem that you are really acknowledging what people are going through. So they're like masterminds behind that, and so they'll be leading those 2, and then I'll be back with the more boring topics, including finance and ops, the following week. Oh, Jessica, you have a question. So what would you recommend for DTC brands planning to raise funds and relaunch this year? That's a really good question. So one thing that you want to recommend is that venture funds have to invest. They have a directive. So if you have a venture fund, or if you have any sort of institutional fund, you have a directive from the people who gave you money, which are called LPs, that you have to make them a return. So for example, I invested in a VC, and my reason for investing in one of those VCs is because I'm hoping that they make me a return on that money. And so they're not going to make me a return on that money just sitting on it. So they do have to deploy their capital. What I would say is that right now, in talking to so many VCs, because we do work with VCs and help their portfolio companies, they are being so much more stringent and focused on financials. So before, if someone had, you know, a little bit looser of a business model or looser projections in terms of how you're going to hit this, you know, 3x growth in the future, and they were just like, oh, we love the brand, we love the founder, and we love the story, like that's not what they're doing anymore. They want to see like much more attention to financials, and they also want to see a little bit more of a kind of pulling back in terms of like the excess spending on top line growth, and they want to see a real focus on your net margin, like your net revenue, instead of your just like top line, like, oh, like we grew our top line revenues by 100% year on year, but that's because our discounts were through the roof and we went to 25%. And if you look at the net revenue, it's kind of flat. So that's not what they want. Now they really want to look at net. And so I think that it's really interesting for me, someone who really enjoys the financial aspects of a business. I think it's an exciting time because I think we're going to get back to people building brands that have a little bit more longevity versus these like flash in the pan companies that are coming along where you're all of a sudden, you know, you're seeing this big growth and then you have an exit, but then like it's crashing and burning. So what I would recommend is if you are raising funds, make sure that you as a founder are like extremely buttoned up with your financials and understand how you plan to use the money. And I would also build out your model in terms of what you are raising to assume that this is the last money that you're going to get, because let's just pretend that this is a crisis that's not going to just like automatically come back, and let's say that we do enter a recession. That's when it's really hard to raise money, because the venture funds are going to have a hard time raising money. So if you get funding within this next kind of 6 months to 12-month window, raise enough, raise as much as you can. And don't think about what percent of the company you're giving away, because if you have a small percent of a huge pie, that's always better than having a large percent of a tiny little pie that might disappear. So raise as much as possible. In terms of relaunching, if you are relaunching something or launching something within the next 9 months, I would definitely say like you have to be mindful of the language and your brand's tone of voice in terms of how you want to talk to people who are staying at home or who are dealing with this crazy crisis. But just know that VCs are deploying cash. They want to see really good brands, but they're not taking as much risk. So make sure that you are very buttoned up in terms of your 2 to 5 year projections and how you plan to use the money. So if nobody else has any questions, then I just wanted to say thank you guys so much. This is so nice to do these chats and to kind of share some knowledge, and I'm always welcome to any suggestions on topics that might help you guys during this period. So if you have any specific requests, shoot them over in email. We also just launched some social channels on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. On Instagram, we'll be doing some kind of mini tips in the stories. So it's Spreadsatoria Inc. And so hope to see some of you guys there, and hope to see you guys at the next webinar. Thanks so much. Bye, guys.